So Reverend Ian asked me if I would speak on the shadow. I think everywhere I go, I bring the shadow side out in people. Maybe that's why she invited me to do that. One of my very earliest memories is sitting in the living room listening to the radio with my parents. I think I was about 3 or 4 years old. And there was a program that would come on, and this very menacing voice would come out of the radio, out of the speaker, and it says, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? You know, only the shadow knows. The shadow knows, you got it, that's it. And so I used to be frightened by that, and so I would run, I'd grab my blanket and run and hide behind the sofa. And I would listen to the program behind the sofa wrapped up in my blanket. So just in case the shadow showed up in the living room, he wouldn't find me, you see. So I think I spent the next 30 years of my life trying to hide from my shadow, but it hasn't worked. And so that's why I'd like to talk about the power and the wisdom and the courage it takes to engage this particular work. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, says, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness unconscious, by making the unconscious conscious, by making the shadow light, so to speak. So this afternoon, almost said this morning, I want to talk to you about what the shadow is and how it develops, very briefly. I want to talk about why shadow work is so powerful and so important on our spiritual journey. And I want to talk about some specific ways to work with the shadow and to integrate it. So I better talk fast. There's a lot there, isn't there? The shadow is a natural result of developing a persona. Now, the persona is literally a Greek word for mask. And the persona is something we all have. We learn how to show up in the world by how our parents model and our family models this for us. So every child wants to be like mom and dad, whether they know it or not. And so we begin to mimic our parents and our the role models and the authority figures in our life. We begin to take on their characteristics as, okay, this is how you be in the world. So the persona is what we're taught to be. We're taught by our family, we're taught by our teachers. A little bit later, we're taught by our peers. And so we look to how we want to face the world by putting on this particular mask. And that's necessary and that's important because we live, hopefully, in a civilized society, and we have rules and we have ways of being with one another. And so that's all part of the persona. The persona is not a bad thing at all. It's just that it's not all of who we are. The problem is that in developing the persona, we identify totally with that. So we become the person our family wants us to be. Or in some cases, we become just the opposite of what our family wants us to be. But in either case, we're forming our sense of self vis-a-vis the family around us, positively or negatively. So that's who we believe that we are. And many people go their entire life just believing that's all of who they are, as this created self, the manufactured self. But as we identify with only part of who we are, we lose sight of other parts of who we are. And these other parts of who we are are never really developed, they never mature, and they never grow properly. So if we're taught that certain parts of ourselves are not okay, or not important, or not lovable, or not acceptable, or not valuable, we will push that down. We will try to squash it, or kill it, or hide it. We don't want the world to see it. And so most of the time, it's fear and or shame that keeps some of this stuff in the shadow. Just some examples. You know, if we're taught, for example, if we get angry, which is quite natural for human beings to get angry, especially 2 and 3 and 4-year-old children to get angry, it's quite natural. But if for some reason we're taught that it's not okay to be angry, that it's bad, that anger means you're a bad person, or if we see anger acted out in really violent or harmful ways, we're going to be afraid of that anger. We're going to think that anger is bad. Or could be sexuality. We might be taught that sexuality is bad. Or we might be taught that tenderness is bad. Maybe we get laughed at if we cry, or if we have any sadness, you see. So different cultures, different families have different messages, but we all grow up believing, consciously or unconsciously, believing that there's a part of me that's okay, there's a part of me that's so dangerous I can't even look at it. So we, so to speak, push it down the basement and try to lock the door. So this happens. It isn't a mistake. It isn't anybody's fault. It's just, that's the way it happens, you see, because we are human beings that are partly instinctual and partly civilized. And as Freud mentioned, we're constantly trying to manage those two parts of ourselves. He called the parental civilized self the superego, and the instinctive self he called the id. Okay. Jung used a little bit different language, but the persona and the shadow are not exactly the same thing, but they're very similar. The persona is what you want people to, how you want people to see you. The shadow is just the opposite. So if you want to know what's in your shadow, it's really relatively easy to do. Just write on a piece of paper. Actually, get a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. On the left-hand side, put down all of the things you want people to know about you. Hey, you know, I'm handsome and intelligent and charming and whatever, you know, blah, 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 all these things that, yeah, we put on our resume. And then on the other side, you know what I'm going to say, don't you? On the other side of the line, just write down just the opposite. Okay? And so the right side of the line will show us what our shadow is, and the left side of the line will show us what our persona is. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but the question is, can I embrace both sides of the line? If I can't, I'm splitting myself in half, and I'm not acknowledging that who I am is okay. I'm saying that part of myself is not okay. And that's so much of the time what we're taught, and we grew up believing that. So the shadow is a natural result of developing a persona. Shadow work, as we often use the term, is the work of integrating or bringing into conscious awareness all parts of ourselves. So the work is to become aware of, to become acquainted with, and ultimately to embrace all of who we are. What's on the left side, what's on the right side, the persona and the shadow as well. Doesn't mean we act out the shadow. The persona may guide our actions, which is a good idea, much of the time. But there's a difference between consciously saying, you know, I'm going to behave a certain way because it's appropriate, vis-a-vis, I can't even feel those feelings because they're bad, you see. So we may feel anger. It's quite natural to feel anger. If I can embrace that anger and not act it out, and maybe channel that energy in some positive way, that's the result of integrating the shadow and the persona. But if I am afraid of my anger, or if I'm humiliated by my anger, if I believe that anger is unspiritual or bad or something like that, I'm going to identify solely with the persona, and that anger energy is going to come out sideways. It's going to come out in some toxic, unhealthy, and destructive way. Because what happens is that whatever we try to bury, we're really burying it alive. It's still alive, even though it's buried. And it's going to claw its way out of the basement sooner or later and come and haunt us. Have you ever had dreams like that, where there's something in the basement and it's coming out? Well, that's classic shadow dreams with them. So living with the shadow and living without integrating or acknowledging the shadow is like living with only half of our life energy available to us. So imagine what it would be like if with your body you couldn't use half of your body. Let's say the right half or the left half of your body. You know, you could still function, but it would not be optimal. You couldn't walk, you couldn't do everything that you could with an able-bodied 2 hands, 2 legs, you see. Well, it's the same way with our psyche. If we're going to hide, kill, or maim half of our psyche, we're going to be living half of a life. Our energy will be repressed, our ability to make choices will be repressed, and our view of life in the world will become distorted. So that's one of the issues, one of the problems. Another problem is that oftentimes it shows up as health issues, financial issues, very often relationship issues are almost always shadow projections in some way. So there's all sorts of problems that arise out of not working with the shadow. One of the characteristics of the unclaimed shadow is that of projection. Projection, if you could think of the old-timer, if you remember, or if your parents remember what the old-time projector looks like, where you have a light, a lens, and then a screen. And on the lens, there's a film or there's a picture of some sort. Well, projection works much the same way. What we don't see behind us, we'll see on the screen in front of us. So it's like either we discover the shadow directly, and it becomes part of us and part of our energy, and we have access to it, or we disown it. We think it's not in me at all, and it's all in you, or them, or somebody. Anybody, but not me, right? So when we project a shadow, we're disowning that quality within ourselves, and we're putting that quality totally onto and into someone else. One author says it's like using other people as trash containers for the disowned parts of yourself. It's like, I don't want to deal with this junk, so I'm going to put it on you. And make it all about you. Okay. So that doesn't work either. And in fact, one of the ways the shadow shows up collectively is through prejudice. Racial prejudice, ethnic prejudice. Anytime we have an enemy, we call them, those people, those fill in the blanks, the other. That is very often shadow projection. Whatever we're unwilling to look at within ourselves. If there's some shame within ourselves that we're not willing to see, we will project it onto someone else, and we will see them as inferior, bad, despicable, whatever the case might be, you see. We are putting our shame, unacknowledged shame, onto someone else in believing that they're not valuable. They're not human. The Nazis did this with the Jews back 50-some years ago. And of course, it's been done in our culture with minorities right from the get-go, with the African Americans, Hispanics, and Irish, German, just about every ethnic group has sooner or later been prejudiced against at one time or another in our culture. So it's a process that if I don't see what's going on within myself, I'm going to put it on someone else, and that creates the mentality of the enemy. It was so interesting. I remember growing up in the Cold War era and remembering that, practicing the duck and cover in grade school. If a nuclear bomb hits the school, I was supposed to get underneath my desk and put my hands over my head, and somehow that was going to save me, you see. But we all did it nonetheless because we felt like we had to do something, I guess. So we lived with this very real possibility that the whole human race could destroy itself, quite literally. And we came close a few times. And then when the Soviet Union sort of rolled over and played dead in the late 80s, my first thought was, wow, that's going to bring peace on earth. And there's no longer this threat of war. We no longer have this enemy. Wrong. It wasn't but a matter of a few months or years that, guess what? We found a new enemy. It wasn't the Soviet Union. It was either Al-Qaeda or ISIS it was a different them, you see. So there's always going to be a them until we do our inner work. And then there's just us. And when there's just us, it doesn't mean that we have to be stupid and say, I'm not going to protect myself from somebody that wants to hurt me. But I'm doing that as a way of honoring myself rather than trying to destroy somebody I think is bad, which is a very different way of working with things. So, some ways to integrate the shadow. And integration means that we make the shadow part of who we are. We bring that energy back. We reclaim that arm, that leg that we haven't been using for a long time. We reclaim these parts of ourselves that we have shunted down in the basement. And this energy, rather than fighting ourselves with this energy that is then available under our conscious direction, then I can begin to move in a direction fueled by this energy rather than fighting it, rather than dragging it along. So one of the quickest ways to work with the shadow is with projection, just to notice where projection arises. So how do I recognize projection? Well, jokingly, I often say it's what everybody else is doing, okay? You can always recognize projection because you're never doing it. Somebody else is doing it. That's projection, when everybody else is doing it and you're not, It's like the story of the drunk that's driving the wrong way down the freeway, and he's got the radio on, and there's a bulletin that says, oh, attention, attention, be careful. He says there's a car going the wrong way on I-70. You know, and the inebriated driver hears that and says, a car going the wrong way? I see hundreds of them going the wrong way. And that's what projection is. I'm not going the wrong way. Everybody else is going the wrong way, you see. So that can be very destructive and very difficult. So as we begin to recognize our projections, that's the first step in beginning to own the shadow. So how do I recognize the projection? Well, a projection can be either positive or negative, but anytime we make somebody bigger than life or worse than anybody possibly could be, that's probably a projection. Anytime we are making someone all bad or all good, when they can't do anything right or when they can't do anything wrong, when they're bigger than life or when they're so little they're not worth talking to, that's a projection. Anytime we feel like somebody is against us, we're probably projecting something onto them. Okay. And again, it's true that people sometimes, for whatever reason, are against us, but we know how to deal with it effectively if we're present in the moment and when we're integrated. If we're projecting the shadow, all that does is reinforce our shadow repression. So we begin by looking for anything that triggers strong emotions in us. Not just simple anger, but really intense and long-lasting emotions. For example, if somebody cuts you off on the freeway, classic example. Driving along, minding my own business, and here comes somebody, zip, 1,000 miles an hour, and they pull right in front of me. Okay, so most people would get irritated, angry. So if you get angry, crazy drivers, take a breath, continue, that's the end of it, okay? Comes and it goes. Anger is just a feeling. On the other hand, if we have repressed anger in the shadow, we're going to be planning that person's death. We're going to be looking at how we can track them down and lock them up and torture them or do whatever they deserve. You see, they're bad, and they didn't just do something bad, but they're an evil person, and they don't deserve to live. Okay? Those kind of conversations, those typically are shadow stuff. Because what we're doing is we're going down the basement and we're bringing up all of the stuff out of the basement, throwing it on the fire. So it's like what happened is maybe a stick in the fire, but rather than just burning one stick, we run down the basement and we get a whole pile of logs and throw on the fire and then throw gasoline on top of that, you see. So that's typically what happens is when our anger is over the top, when it lasts a long time, when we find ourselves ruminating and obsessing over something. Or there can be a positive projection, you know, when somebody is so wonderful they can do no wrong. And that's typically what happens when, for example, with the Nazis, with the Germans, back prior to World War II, the Jews were labeled as all bad, and then that made room for this Savior, okay, who can do nothing wrong. So that's the projection, that's the positive projection. projection. So I'm projecting all that's good within me onto someone else, and I'm projecting all that's bad on me to someone else. And so in the religious sphere, we see this as Jesus is bigger than life. Jesus is good, and I'll never attain or be what Jesus was. He's in heaven and I'm on earth. I'm a lowly worm of the dust, and only Jesus can save me. That's the positive projection. That's a projection of my true nature onto something else. And then the shadow projection is watch out for Satan, right? So here's Jesus over here going to save me. Here's Satan over here going to do me in. And both of those are simply projections of what's within my own self. Yes. Jesus is the projection of my Christ self, my own divine nature, and the devil is the projection of my own shadow. Okay? So, again, I'm not saying that we don't see goodness and badness in the world, but we see it simply as passing phenomena. It doesn't grab us. It doesn't have that same energy. So when you recognize the projection, the thing to do is to begin to recognize what quality is being projected. Okay? So there's somebody I don't like. What is it I don't like about that person? Okay? Because chances are they're doing something I won't give myself permission to do. So let me give you an example out of my own life experience from some years back. I despised people that were arrogant. I despised people that were had strong self-esteem and thought they were better than everybody else, in my opinion. And they really deserved to be cut down, put in their place. They were bad people. Well, it took a while, but I eventually began to see my own low self-esteem, my own sense of unworth, my own sense of shame. And the arrogance that I was looking at out there was the feeling of self-love that I was not allowing myself to have. I was condemning them for loving themselves and thinking well of themselves, just as I was condemning myself for that. You know, if you were a good person, you don't do that. You know, you recognize that you're really a worm of the dust, just like me, if you're a good person, because that's what I've been taught. Or if I see someone angry and I want to condemn them or humiliate them or make them wrong, or if I'm terribly afraid of anger, fear is another one. You know, a lot of folks are terrified of any kind of conflict. So if that's showing up, that's probably a shadow projection. So you see, anytime we make something more than what it is, when we integrate the shadow, we can deal with life as life is. But when we're not integrating the shadow, when we're not claiming what's in the unconscious, then we're not seeing life as it is, we're seeing life as we are. We're seeing life through the mirror of our own lack of awareness. So, recognizing that quality, maybe it's anger, maybe it's sexuality, maybe it's tenderness or humility, whatever it is that I either hate or that I want to worship, begin to recognize that's really part of myself. And begin to dialogue with that part. Be willing to look at that angry part of myself. Oh no, I don't get angry. I'm much too spiritual. My halo on straight here? Okay. Okay. So that's the persona, right? I want people to know how spiritual I am. And if I show my anger, they'll know that I'm not spiritual. And shame on me. And nobody will love me. I mean, that's the way the conversation goes. And that's reinforced by the shadow. Because the shadow is part of the past. So, we talk a lot about living in the present moment, but we're really only living in the present moment if we've integrated all of the unconscious parts of ourselves. To the degree that we have disowned the shadow, to that degree we're dragging along old baggage. It's almost like if you travel a lot, as I do, just imagine what it would be like if you only unpacked half of your suitcase after each trip. And then you drag behind you the unpacked suitcases from the past. You know, after a few trips, we're dragging a lot of baggage behind us, aren't we? And that's heavy stuff. And when that baggage starts to move, it's got a lot of momentum. So it's work that's very difficult, and yet it's very powerful. And the key to all of this is to recognize that who and what we really are is divine. There's one presence, one power, God the good. You and I and every human being is an expression of that divinity. But that divinity can get lost. We can push it aside. We can fail to see it. We can reject it. We can be afraid of it. And when that happens, it's like an eddy in the stream. The divine energy begins to flow backwards, so to speak. And it begins to be counterproductive. So that's where the work is in recognizing that it's all divine energy. But it's energy that may be blocked or it may be shunted in the wrong direction. So it's difficult work, but it's very powerful work. And at the same time, it's not work if we recognize my job is to wake up, to be aware, and the healing comes from God, from the divinity that we are.